Good morning, everyone. My name is Patrick Carrington, and I currently serve as the Diversity and Inclusion Coordinator for the Kentucky Administrative Office of the Courts. Today, I would like to welcome you to our 2022 Black History Month celebration. Providing us with our opening remarks for today is none other than Chief Justice John D. Minton, Jr. Chief Minton.
Thank you, Patrick. Good morning to everybody and welcome to the Administrative Office of the Court's Black History Month celebration. You know, we all miss the fellowship of celebrating this event together and seeing each other in person, but I am honored to bring you virtual greetings on behalf of the entire Supreme Court. My fellow justices and I hope that all of you are staying safe and healthy and looking forward to warmer spring weather and the lifting of mask mandates. I want to start today by briefly highlighting the important work that the Kentucky Court of Justice is doing to address racial, ethnic, and equity disparities within the court system and to increase diversity among our workforce in the court system. I'm proud of the progress we've made since 2014 when our work on these issues really became more intentional. Our efforts are having positive impacts on justice-involved individuals and on our Court of Justice family. But there's always more work to be done, and we are committed to institutionalizing solutions to ensure that positive changes will be carried on in the future. In February of last year, the Supreme Court approved the court system's first diversity, equity, and inclusion statement and policy within the personnel policies of the Kentucky Court of Justice. And as one of our first steps toward implementing this policy, the Court of Justice created an internship program geared toward providing diverse students at Kentucky State with an opportunity to learn more about the court system. So 2 students from KSU were selected for the program and completed an 8-week internship with the CDW office in Franklin County. These students gained valuable experience working with juveniles involved in the justice system and learning about court processes. We're grateful to Kentucky State for this partnership, and we look forward to expanding the program in the future. The Court of Justice continues to provide diversity trainings across the Commonwealth, including sessions on community trauma, inclusive language, cultural competence, and implicit bias. Statewide program staff have also been trained to better understand the current racial tensions and social unrest. These trainings have led to a number of important discussions and problem solving on the local level to address barriers and access to courts. Each year, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History designates a national theme for Black History Month. And the theme for 2022 is Black Health and Wellness, which celebrates Black scholars and medical practitioners and wellness initiatives within Black communities. I appreciate the education that Patrick Carrington, our Diversity Inclusion Coordinator for AOC, has provided to us this month about African Americans who have made impressive contributions to the fields of health, medicine, and wellness. And now I'll turn the program over to Patrick to introduce our guest speaker. Patrick?
Thank you, Chief Minton. Dr. Sheree Dawson-Edwards will be our keynote speaker of the day. Dr. Sheree Dawson-Edwards is the Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs and an Associate Professor for the Department of Criminal Justice at the University of Louisville. She also directs the College of Arts and Sciences Social Change minor. She holds a PhD in Public Policy and Administration from Virginia Commonwealth University and a Master of Science in Justice Administration from the University of Louisville. She has taught a variety of criminal justice courses, but her research and teaching interests center on the intersection of public policy and criminal justice with a specific focus on schools and juvenile justice. In addition to a career in teaching, Dr. Dawson-Edwards has held positions in probation and victim services. She is a national board member of the American Civil Liberties Union and serves on the executive committee of American Civil Liberties Union of Kentucky. In 2016, she was awarded the distinguished 2016 College of Arts and Sciences Community Service Award. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Sheree Dawson Edwards.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Chief. I'm excited to be here. This is not a stranger relationship. I've worked with lots of folks in the Court of Justice and just the administrative office of the courts and court designated workers for some time now. And so I'm no stranger to the folks that are probably watching this live stream. But I just wanted to thank you all for having me today. And thank you, Patrick, for your work on uplifting the well-being and health of African Americans in this country. So, when I was asked to do this keynote, I was really excited. And then I read the topic and I was like, oh, wait, that's kind of not like my expertise. And I was like, well, Patrick, I have kind of a spin that I can do on it, related to some of the work that I have been doing, particularly around Black girls, Black and brown girls, and the things that they need. So I decided to do a presentation that kind of combines thinking about, our mental health needs, some of the experiences that we have today and how they're rooted in some of the experiences in the past, and then wrapping it all up into what does this all mean for Black History Month? And so I'm going to attempt to share my screen. I practiced, so I should be able to do it fine. But I would, if Patrick, you can give me kind of a thumbs up if it's actually doing what it's supposed to be doing, that would be awesome. Okay. So I titled this particular presentation, Updating the Narrative, Acknowledging Trauma and Joy in Black History. And I know that, based on what I just heard described, that, you all spent some time talking about, or celebrating the traditions and what Black folks dealing with health and medicine have brought to the table, and that is awesome, and that is part of the joy of Black history. But I think we all know, and Chief Justice Minton talked about the work that the Court of Justice has been doing, is that where there's joy, there is also trauma in history that must be acknowledged, right? And so this is a combination of thinking about those things, and even where there are things that are disturbing about our history, how can we find joy in the contributions of what we're doing today? So I am dedicating this particular short talk, because I know I have 20 minutes, to the mothers of modern gynecology. And I'll talk more about them in a little bit, but some of you maybe have heard of J. Marion Sims, who has been deemed the father of gynecology. And I'd like to spend some time talking about the Black mothers of gynecology. But before I get into that, I always start every talk that has anything to do with racial equity with some type of quote that just kind of centers and grounds us. And so this says, when we identify where our privilege intersects with somebody else's oppression, we'll find our opportunities to make real change. And so when you look at that quote, yes, certainly there's some, negative aspects to acknowledge, that there's oppression and there's, intersections and there's privilege. But when we think about joy and finding healing, then we find our opportunities to make real change. And then I also can't ever talk about racial equity without this particular visual. And this to me kind of grounds any conversation that I have with, and we won't spend time going through it. That's a whole different workshop. But it kind of grounds, when we talk about these intersections, what does that mean? And if you look on this particular wheel, you'll see these different social identities on the outside. And then as you move in, you'll see where the power is centered. And so you can look at skin color, you can look at mental health, you can look at, all these different language and gender, you can look at all of those things and see where the marginalization is and where the power is centered. And I think through some of the conversations or examples that I give today, you can just kind of think about this visual and think about how those things historically have happened, but then also how they may be manifesting even in the moments that we live in today. So just to kind of center us on today's kind of stats, because I am going to talk a little bit about racial trauma and trauma stressors and things of that nature. And so I think it's important, I'm a professor, it's important to have some kind of stats to support what you're articulating. And this is a recent report that said African-American adults are 20% more likely to experience experience mental health issues than the rest of the population. 25% of African Americans seek treatment for mental health issue compared to 40% of white individuals. And I want to just pause there and give space to that statistic. And I think what that does for us is kind of tells us, like, historically, there are some differences in access to mental health care, as well as just how that's culturally transmitted and how it's viewed differently. So only 25% of African Americans seek treatment for mental health issues compared to 40%. And it says the reason for the drop-off include misdiagnosis by doctors, socioeconomic factors, and a lack of mental health professionals that look like us. And so representation certainly matters. I even think about representation for my doctors, and what does that look like? And that's difficult to find. No, this is a sidebar, but my son had a skin issue as a small child, and we went to a doctor that did not look like us, and they did not diagnose it. They didn't know what it was, and then we waited months to get into the only Black dermatologist that was here at the time, and it immediately diagnosed it, and immediately it was gone. And so there is something to be said about representation and lack thereof and access. African Americans are less likely than white people to die from suicide as teenagers, but Black and African American teenagers are more likely to attempt suicide than are white teenagers. And then you go down to talking about that access or lack of the professionals. Only 6.2% of psychologists, 5.6% of advanced practice psychiatric nurses, 12.6% of social workers, and 21.3% of psychiatrists are members of minority groups. And so that kind of gives you some, thinking about, as we talk about trauma and racial trauma and trauma stressors, how all that could play into how we are experiencing our world today, and maybe how we're experiencing it a little bit different. So I began starting to think about this work. I actually talked to Rachel Bingham a little bit about it last week in an email. I began thinking about this work because of the institutions that I'm primarily a part of, and that is the University of Louisville. I work a lot with JCPS schools. I've done research with the Administrative Office of the Courts. And when we think about those spaces, then we must acknowledge the experience of people and people of color in those spaces, and how the stressors that can be induced there can be a little bit different. And so this is a quote that I used from a talk that I did actually on my campus to try to get people to understand how people of color have to navigate predominantly white institutions and predominantly white institutional spaces. So it says, white institutional spaces create a complex environment where people of color must navigate racial narratives, ideologies, and discourses while simultaneously attempting to achieve institutional success to reap the material rewards of these elite institutional settings. And so, it is Black History Month, so I am centering Black folks. I often don't get an opportunity to do that, but I appreciate the opportunity to do it today. And I think it's important, and I found a quote to support that we not only uplift all the positive things that we can in Black History Month, but we also acknowledge where that can be. Some of those things that seem positive can also be harmful. And so this quote says, we can't truly observe Black History Month without seeing trauma or seeing trauma overcome, right? And so a lot of what we do when we talk about Martin Luther King Jr., we talk about Ida B. Wells, or we talk about, these historical figures, we are seeing trauma overcome and people fighting for things. And we appreciate that because we have certainly all of us have certainly benefited from it. And I know for sure I have benefited from it. So seeing trauma overcome, but we also have to see the trauma. In addition, we can't fully serve our clients and communities without listening to their stories. And I know this is something that you all have been working on because I did some research, and I know that people reported that there was virtual dialogues and people could actually tell their stories and listen to each other and create space. And I know Pastor Palmer has worked with the Kentucky Court of Justice to make sure that those spaces are available. We may be just one rung on the ladder to liberation, but we can be a firm hand to hold while each individual takes another step up. So this, may not seem that it relates a lot to what we're talking about today, but in a talk that I did with some faculty, I don't know, it was probably almost a year ago, I was talking about the emotional and intellectual labor that people of color often have to take on in the workspace. And this particular narrative came out of a study, and it has nothing to do with me today because I actually wanted to do this Black History talk. But on campus last year, I remember my boss, he was like, well, are we doing a Black History Month event? And I was like, oh, it's Black History Month. Like, it's Black History Month for me every month, right? And so I almost forget that it's Black History Month. And then when I'm called on to create an event on campus or whatnot, it can be kind of, traumatizing because I want to talk about this stuff all the time. I don't want it to be relegated. And what I love about you all as an organization, the whole organization, is that you all are doing these conversations all the time. It's not just in this moment. And I think that I have to give you your accolades for doing that. But oftentimes Black History Month is just a snapshot of people's racial equity deliverance, or reckoning. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that we live this every single day, not just in a month. And yes, it's awesome to have a month that is centering us, but we are also fighting to be centered in other spaces all the time and not just in a month. So I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about trauma stressors. And let me just really quickly give this definition of racial trauma. So it says the mental and emotional injury caused by encounters with racial bias and ethnic discrimination, racism, and hate crime. Any individual that has experienced an emotional, painful, sudden, and uncontrollable racist encounter is at risk of suffering from a race-based traumatic stress injury. And I don't think we talk about that enough. When people are like, oh, it's always about race. Oh, you're always da 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 da. Because some of us have to live in that every single day. And so the medical professionals say there are 3 types of racial traumatic stressors. They're the direct traumatic stressors that includes all direct traumatic impacts of living within a society of structural racism and or being on the receiving end of individual racist attacks. Now, we're live stream, so there's no, chat, but normally I'd ask people type in an example of a direct traumatic stressor, and that is because I'm a professor and I'm always in teacher mode. So, we know what a direct traumatic stressor is, that you actually experienced it, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's on the street, whether it's at school, you experience that directly. And then you have vicarious or indirect traumatic impacts of living with systemic racism and individual racist actions. And those are things that you may have seen happen. So I know that some of the work that you all have done in the last 2 years, which it's hard for me to even think that it's been 2 years since, Breonna Taylor was killed in Louisville, or George Floyd, or, Ahmaud Arbery. But I know that some of the work that you all have done has dealt with the fact that it's vicarious traumatic stresses. We are watching things happen to people that look like us. I'm watching things that are happening to people that look like my 15-year-old son, who is now 6'3", and I'm just like, oh, people are going to think you're a grown man and you're just my baby, and so it doesn't matter that I've never seen something directly happen to my 15-year-old. What matters is that I know that there are Black boys like him that have had experiences with the police or, with persons of authority that have not ended well. And that is vicarious traumatic stress. And so I carry that with me in how I parent him, how I worry about him, and it's real. And I think what's important for us to acknowledge when we talk about Black health and wellness is that it's real, whether it's happened directly to me or not, the stress is still there and the stress is still real. Another one type of racial trauma is called transmitted traumatic stress. And transmitted traumatic stress is that which is generationally transmitted. So from your parents or from a teacher, but in another generation. So they've taken their historical experiences and they've tried to help shape you so that you don't have to experience that as well. And so I ground this in that because it's important. And that transmitted traumatic stress also to me relates a lot to Black history and what, my parents' generation experienced and what my grandparents' generations experienced and whatnot. And that's important to do. So this is just, I'm not going into this, but this is an article, and I'm happy to share some of these links with anybody who's interested. But as we start on racial equity journeys, or continue on racial equity journeys, like Chief Justice Minton said, like you've been doing this work since 2014, then we have to acknowledge that. And I think that I found this when I was, working with the court designated workers over the last 2 years, is that as new people come in, you have to keep talking about these things in kind of a grounding kind of way. And that there are people that are still getting this awakening and this reckoning and understanding and acknowledging that things that have been presented to us may not be the way that they really happened. And I think I have the next slide that's going to get into that. And I think I probably have 10 more minutes, Patrick? Is that what I have? Okay. All right. And so what I have here is it says what we normally do in Black History Month. And so I know that we wanted to do some acknowledgement of contributions. And there's we have wonderful access to things now, right? That people didn't always have. And so you can go on the internet and you can Google, Black contributions to medicine. You can Google all of these things. And I found a wonderful timeline that started in 1783 and it went all the way up to Charles Drew and talked about, the first and Howard University and all of that. And that's great. This is wonderful to know. It's wonderful to know that, 1783, even though he didn't have a medical degree, James Durham was, doing medical practices, and he was treating patients for diphtheria and things like that. It's wonderful to know when you have the first Black American to practice with a medical degree. It's wonderful to know. And as a Black woman, it's always wonderful for me to know about my intersections and how I, my representation, when we had the first Black woman physician in this country. And so there's lots of things that we can learn and celebrate and uplift. And is the truth. These are true things. This is really what happened. And those are wonderful things to celebrate. But there's also things in our medical history that we've failed to celebrate. And when I say update the narrative, it doesn't mean to ignore the Charles Drews or the Dr. Durham, or I guess he wasn't a doctor, but medical professional Durham. It's not that we can't acknowledge and celebrate those things, but we also have to acknowledge that where there's pain in how we get to where we got in modern medicine. And so I don't know if you all have ever heard of Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy, but they are considered the mothers of modern gynecology. And so I talked to you a little bit about J. Marion Sims, who was a white doctor who used the bodies of these Black enslaved girls. When you read about them, it'll say the women. Now, I know that concepts of adulthood have changed since enslavement, but Anarcha was 17, and I think Betsy might have been 14. And so our history even acknowledges them as women when they were, in fact, what we would call girls to this day. And so they were treated by J. Marion Sims, but they were also experimented on by J. Marion Sims. And so when you read the history of these mothers of gynecology, you read that he, helped some slave women, who were pregnant and had, things that went wrong. But not only did he try to help, so he started with trying to help Anarcha, who then lost her baby, but then continued to experiment on what I've read about, reported 11 enslaved Black girls. And so I think it's important that we acknowledge the truth in that history, that guess what? I benefit from that. I have 2 children. So I definitely benefit from this modern medicine, but I had never heard of Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy until a year and a half ago. And the reason that I heard about them was that I was doing talks on, Black and brown girls and, public institutions and how they are treated today. And then I was like, oh, let me go back and look and see previous things, And I came across the story of Anarcha. Westcott is her last name. And then I learned about Lucy and Betsy. And so it's that is what I'm saying when I say we have to honor and celebrate our wins, but we also have to honor and celebrate the people like Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy. For them to be now called the mothers of modern gynecology juxtaposed with J. Marion Sims, who was called the father of gynecology for over almost 200 years. I think that is an important movement from celebrating and joy and including things that we don't always include. You may have heard of Henrietta Lacks, because there have been movies and articles and books about her as well. And I think this is another person that we definitely have to consider a contributor to modern medicine, right? And just because these women were not doctors does not mean they didn't contribute to modern medicine. So Henrietta Lacks was a Black woman in Virginia who died of cancer. And the doctors took some cells from her, and she had these miracle making cells, and they still use them. They're called HeLa cell line, and they still use them today in modern medicine to study medicine. And there was a lot of controversy a couple years ago about whether or not they should still be using them. But at the time, there was no requirement for them to get permission to take the cells and then reproduce and use them. And so that's been kind of a point of contention. But I heard about Henrietta Lacks many, many years ago, way before I heard about Anarcha Westcott. And I think that these are different ways of looking at contributions, right? And while Henrietta was already sick and she was, at Johns Hopkins where they took the cells to treat her, for many years, what her contribution to medicine was never acknowledged. And now there's more and more acknowledgement for that and to that. And I think that that's important. And then the last contributed to medicine that I'd like to bring up is Dr. Grace M. James, who was a local pediatrician here in the Louisville area, and one of the first medical professionals at the University of Louisville. She has a long history in contribution to this city. A lot of the folks that are my parents' ages, they're all like, oh yeah, that was my doctor. And I will say that I didn't know a lot about Grace M. James until 2 years ago, when there was a new school named after her here in Louisville named Grace M. James Academy. And Grace M. James Academy is a STEAM school. So they do science, technology, engineering, art, and math. It's a STEAM school, but it has an Afrocentric curriculum. And so they say they center, Black children, but that's not the only people that go to the school. And so it's interesting that, Grace M. James, lots of people in the previous generation knew her, and now everybody knows who Grace M. James is because now there's a school named after her. I should say, in full disclosure, my sister is the principal and the founding principal of this school. So she actually kind of created it. It is awesome. If you're ever in Louisville and you want to see an awesome school with an Afrocentric curriculum that has a diverse group of girls that go there, then I encourage you to stop by and see Grace M. James Academy. So, I wanted to save Grace M. James for last because I think it's important that we have this, historical figure here in Louisville as a Black woman pediatrician who did wonderful things. And now we have a school that absolutely centers and upholds her and is built around, making sure that Black and brown girls and Black and brown children see somebody that looks like them. And she was a medical professional. And so with that said, I'm about done, but I just want to say that it is important to acknowledge our traumas, but also acknowledge our joy. And I think that we think about the contributions of our medical professionals, our doctors, that's wonderful, but there's also some traumatic contributions to medicine that we must also acknowledge and give them their due. And I think we do that now when we talk about Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy in a reframe. And sometimes it's about reframing our history so that people can learn more about it. So that's what I have for you all today. I know that you have more on your program and your agenda. I appreciate you all. I appreciate the work that you've done, and I appreciate the relationship that I have with you all. So thank you so much for having me.
Wow.
Sharing.
Wow. Dr. Dawson Edwards, all I can say is wow. Thank you so much for sharing everything that you shared with us today. I learned so much from that brief presentation, and I plan to do a lot more research going forward. on all the joy and the trauma and everything like that. That was powerful. Thank you. Thank you. Awesome. So at this moment in time, you all, we will move into the next segment that we have today on our program. During this next segment, we will be hearing from Chief Court of Appeals Judge Denise Clayton. For those who were expecting a presentation that matches the exact title on our invite, I do want to apologize, as that title was used to prevent a surprise for a special someone who has contributed a lot to our organization, the Kentucky Court of Justice. So, Judge Clayton.
All right. Well, thank you. And also, I'd like to say thank you, Dr. Dawson Edwards, for your presentation. It really was informative. And although you said your mother and people her age knew Dr. Grace James, I also knew Dr. Grace James, and she was my pediatrician when I was a child. And so she was a phenomenal person. And so there is an interesting, sometimes life when I grew up right on the edge of segregation. And with that, there were some things about it that though were encouraging in terms of your access to Black professionals. We were all there together. There was a sense of community regarding that. So it's interesting in terms of when I look on that experience, sometimes as painful as it was, there was, again, as you indicated in your presentation, some joy with that at that time period also. So it's not, one doesn't preclude the other sometimes. So thank you again for the presentation. I was sitting in my office minding my own business when I got a message from Mr. Patrick Carrington, who asked me to participate today on this program. And he asked me kind of to do two things. One is to engage in a bit of subterfuge with him. And secondly was to be funny. So I think that was to make me a funny liar, I guess, was the goal. I'm not sure. I don't know why he thought I could do that, but okay, I get it. So I could give you an overview of the Court of Justice in terms, again, of their work on racial equity. But what I'm really supposed to do is to introduce to you the recipient of the William E. McAnally Trailblazer Award today. And that was what I was asked to do. So I will certainly do that. And I'm doing this for a person who, and I know this term is no longer, I guess, popular, but has a bit of swag here and has been someone that has pushed this forward in terms of eliminating or trying to work on bias in our courtrooms and within the overall judicial system. And this is a person who, when you receive a call, you wonder either what you did wrong or what it is that you're going to be asked to do next. So, of course, who else could that be for me except Chief Justice John Minton? Justice Minton, when you receive a call or a message from him, I think, well, he usually, it's either something he's going to ask me to do or something that maybe he's going to give me a heads up about a reversal coming. I don't know what it's going to be, but it makes you kind of sit back for a moment. I met Chief Justice Minton years ago, at least I think I did, Chief Justice, in Reno. And we were at a judicial conference at the college there addressing the issue of bias in the courtrooms. And so that was my first opportunity to meet him. At this time, Justice Minton was a circuit judge in Warren County. And I think at the time was actually a family court judge here in Jefferson County. Over the years, I've had the opportunity to work on the issues of racial justice, starting first in 2001 with then Chief Justice Lambert when he established the Racial Fairness Commission. And then when Chief Justice Minton began in that role, he allowed us to continue with that work here in Jefferson County. And also, a couple of years ago, we had the community listening session where we pulled in all of our other justice partners to discuss the impact of our programs and what we needed to do in terms of to improve access and fairness to the justice system. You know, the thing that's really kind of remarkable about this is that with each of these reports, with each of these initiatives that Chief Justice Minton has spearheaded, is that it could come back where he ends up receiving the criticism for whatever the justice system has not perhaps done as well as it should. And it reminded me of a proverb, an African proverb that said, a weak man goes only where he is smiled at. And I would say that Chief Justice Minton is more than willing to go into situations where he may not be smiled at, where he may be subject to some concern or criticism or ask questions. And so it's, it's a bold thing for him to do and to accept whatever the results are of the efforts of the court system and to acknowledge where we have fallen short. So the other thing I will say that even though this was, I was asked to participate in this subterfuge, that if those of us who knew Justice McAnulty know the one thing he, among his other traits, is that he was kind of a prankster. So I felt like I was acting in accordance with the spirit of Justice McAnulty in trying to pull this off. So Chief Justice Minton, thank you for all of your work in this area and congratulations.
Well, thank you. It is an honor, and your subterfuge worked. I was sitting here very unsuspecting. This, in fact, I have a speech here I'm supposed to give. I guess I don't give that part of my talk about who the recipient is. You know, I've told this story in this setting before about Bill McAnulty, and we've got a picture at home, and I don't know where else that picture is, but I've got a great picture of Bill straightening my tie. I was supposed to be doing something. He said, "Come here, man, I got to fix this." And he fixed my tie. That's the kind of thing. And then, you know, the story that I've told is my appearance in Jet Magazine was Bill's investiture. And he promised me, "Minton, you stick with me and I'll take you places you've never been before." And indeed he has. And, you know, and Denise, Judge Clayton, the court system has taken me places that I never would have been before. And I hope that I know that I am a better person because of it. And I hope that you and I together, you know, I was thinking of you as our speaker rolled up that thing about, I'm tired of being the only Black person on the dais who's asked to reflect on what it's like to be the only Black person on the dais. We need to get to a day where that doesn't have to happen anymore, where we acknowledge the contributions, the joy, and the challenges that have been a part of our experience. But I want to thank you all for this award. It's truly meaningful, and I'm humbled to receive it. And if Bill was here, he would have, this subterfuge is perfect. He would have made some joke about this, Minton, you know, took you places you never thought you'd go before.
I was afraid to make too many jokes.
You did well. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to work with all of you. So Patrick, what do we do next?
Well, I'll tell you what, Chief Minton. So we actually do have another award that we're giving out as well in the spirit of Justice McAnulty. So I don't want you to throw away that speech just
all
yet.
Right, good. So
For
let me
sure.
go into that, talk about that.
Yes, sir.
All right, this is the third annual McAnulty Award to a deserving member of our Court of Justice family. You know, I've talked about that. I had the great honor of serving on the court with Bill McAnulty, both on the Court of Appeals and on the Supreme Court. He was, as was been pointed out many times, our first African-American justice on the Supreme Court. And he was the first to hold a cabinet level position in Kentucky's state government. He had the distinction of serving at every level of our Court of Justice, including the juvenile court judge, even before the adoption of the judicial article. And he was recognized in many, many different ways, including what was called the Henry V. Pennington Outstanding Judge of the Year Award, the Louisville Bar Association's Judge of the Year, distinguished alumnus of the University of Louisville. He received the Grauman Award from the Brandeis School of Law. And Bill was committed to serving the public in his community. He served on many, many boards, 10 different organizations over his lifetime. But he was a loyal friend who was known for his sound advice, his quick and sometimes biting wit, and actually his good nature. So in honor of this great legacy that we enjoy, we all share, this award we give to someone who's demonstrated a commitment to the profession, to leadership and dependability, generosity toward others, and a dedication toward the community. So I'm pleased to be asked to announce this year's recipient of our McAdonney Award, and that is to Dominique Clark, who is the Racial, Ethnic, and Equity Disparities Coordinator for the Department of Family and Juvenile Services at AOC. In 2017, Dominique began her career with Family and Juvenile Services as a CDW, serving families and youth in Jefferson County. Then in 2019, she was promoted to Racial, Ethnic, and Equity Disparities, or what we call the READ Coordinator, REED Coordinator, providing statewide support to the department for all things around racial and ethnic disparities. So with the goal of improving supports and services to our youth of color, Dominique coordinates the department's equity committee, as well as leading other training initiatives, cross-agency collaboratives, and local community resource efforts. She works every day with the frontline staff to increase equitable outcomes and to reduce barriers. Many of the positive outcomes that we've seen and that we've talked about today through the CDW program are the direct result of Dominique's hands-on approach to working with staff and solving better solutions for youth and their families. Dominique is a true advocate for providing equitable opportunities that provide better outcomes for families and children of color, and consistently implements initiatives that serve that same purpose. Dominique's leadership, commitment, and passion have been a powerful force in engaging staff and improving outcomes for youth and our families of color. Dominique has a BA from the University of North Carolina at Wilmington, and she is currently working on a master's degree at the University of Louisville. She lives in Jefferson County with her dog, Mojo. Dominique, we are grateful to you for your service to this court system and to the Commonwealth of Kentucky, for your dedication to improving the lives of children and families. You are deserving of this recognition. And I want to speak for Bill McAnulty and say that we're proud to have you part of our Court of Justice family and to present you with this recognition. Dominique?
Thank you, Dominique. I want to ask Dominique to say a couple of words, but I think about all the remarks that were made today and the legacy that you are building in the Court of Justice and for our Black youth. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Dominique.
I'm in shock, so I don't have anything to say. When I came to Kentucky, which I tell this story all the time, my parents always say, "We thought you were a lost cause girl," because I was a terror. And so that kind of aligned my passion with helping youth. And then when I was in college, that's when I started really focusing on just how the system is, uneven when it comes to the intersection of Black youth and especially Black girls. And that's when when Dr. Dawson Edwards did her presentation for us, I knew I was on the right path and on the right track. So again, I'm very grateful for this. And again, I'm in shock because I don't know, and I don't like public speaking. So, thank you so much for this. And I will continue to do the work that I'm doing. Thank you again. Now I feel a little embarrassed.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. Congratulations, Dominique. Well deserved, for sure. And Chief Minton, we will go ahead and head into our closing remarks.
Dominique and I, you and I shared that they pulled a fast one on both of us, didn't they? Didn't see it coming. Listen, Patrick, I want to thank you for putting this program together. I have enjoyed the weekly releases so that I have learned more about the contributions of the people of color to health and wellness. And it's been a real learning experience, which is what that's the purpose of the month, to educate all of us a little more about these topics, and to Judge Clayton for sharing her day with us. This is important. I hope we'll continue to do that. And next time, our speaker, thank you so much for not only today's presentation, which was very insightful and helpful, but also for the work that you do with us to make us a better court system. And Patrick, for the work that you all are all doing to make our Court of Justice family look more like the people that we serve. So thanks to everyone. This has been a wonderful day. Thank you for planning it and executing it so well. Maybe the next time we do this, Patrick, we can do it face to face, but this is a really good way to do it and get our message out. So thank you very much. This concludes the event.